Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Harwood Museum of Art. Thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the historic homeland of the Red Willow people within the original territory of Taos Pueblo. As a sign of our humble respect, we recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It is especially meaningful to begin our conversation here, where artists have gathered to consider the many ways land, water, labor, memory, and community shape both our histories and our futures. May this acknowledgement remind us that all of these conversations begin with place and of our ongoing responsibility to respectfully recognize, honor, and partner with the Red Willow people whose land and waters sustain this valley today. My name is Nicole. I am the curator of exhibitions and collections here at the Harwood Museum of Art. And one of the curators of Unearthing Futures, Desenterrando Futuros, alongside Adam Galuda-Gildar, Eric Carpio, with our extremely talented and hardworking assistant curator, Kate Miller, and the guidance of the extraordinary advisory committee that includes Ronald Rael and Joanna Keane Lopez, among many others whose knowledge, experience, and generosity have shaped this project. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this artist conversation celebrating the opening of Unearthing Futures. This exhibition explores Adobe as both material and metaphor. Across the galleries, Earth becomes architecture, memory, infrastructure, sculpture, and sound, revealing how the landscapes we inherit continue to shape the futures we imagine. Presented across the Harwood Museum of Art, the historic Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, and more than 50 historic Adobe sites throughout northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, the exhibition extends into the broader cultural landscape of Adobe through a regional road trip available via app, inviting visitors to encounter Adobe as a living practice across communities, landscapes, and histories. Additionally, a companion publication by Radius Books featuring new essays and conversations like the one we're about to hear today will be released this January. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the many people whose generosity made this exhibition possible. To our donors and sponsors, your support is the foundation that allows projects like this to exist. I would especially like to recognize our premier supporters, the Henry Luce Foundation, Terra Foundation for American Art, the Betty T. Foster Endowment Fund for the Harwood, Via Art Fund, the Sherman and Joyce Scott Family Foundation, Taos County Lodgers Tax, and in-kind support from the CU Boulder Computer Science Department, who helped us with the app. Your investment in this exhibition has been truly extraordinary. We're also deeply grateful to our lead supporters, Enchanted Outpost Magazine, Sherry Livney and Steve Hanks, Thomas DeFoya of Chubby Construction, 203 Fine Art, Richard B. Siegel Foundation, Marcy Rumsfeld and Santiago Baca, Janara Bornstein, and Mary DeMito and Taos Lifestyle. Please take a moment during your visit to see our donor recognition wall, which is at the doorway, which acknowledges the many other additional individuals, foundations, businesses, and partners whose generosity helped make this exhibition possible. I'd also like to recognize the extraordinary team. To our public programs team, thank you for creating such a thoughtful and generous opening weekend. I encourage everyone to explore the many incredible public programs taking place throughout the exhibition, which you can find on our website. And I'd especially like to recognize our installation crew and facilities team. The scale and complexity of this exhibition demanded an unbelievable amount of creativity, flexibility, and dedication, and they have been absolutely extraordinary, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them with some applause. Today's conversation will last approximately 1 hour, followed by 15 minutes of audience questions. The conversation will move fluidly between English and Spanish. After the panel, you'll have about 30 to 40 minutes to explore the exhibition before the museum transitions for this afternoon's opening celebration. And we hope you'll join us at 4 o'clock for the community celebration and 8 o'clock for the after party. Joining us this morning are Joanna Keane Lopez, Ronald Rael, Christine Howard Sandoval, Gabriel Chaile, Rafa Esparza, and Santino Gonzales. And we are incredibly fortunate to have this conversation moderated by the brilliant Raquel Gutiérrez. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Raquel is a critic, essayist, poet, performer, and educator. Their memoir, Brown Neon, was recognized by The New Yorker as one of the best books of 2022 and by Hyperallergic as one of the year's best art books. They were a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and recipient of the Publishing Triangle Judy Grant Award for Lesbian Nonfiction. This year, Raquel received both a United States Artist Fellowship and a Foundation for Contemporary Arts Fellowship in Poetry, and their first poetry collection, Southwest Reconstruction, was published last December. One of the unexpected gifts of this exhibition has been what has happened between these artists. Some came together for the first time through conversations around this exhibition. Others had known one another for years. Across studio visits, long conversations, shared meals, travels across northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and the remarkable artist dialogue featured in our Radius publication, so beautifully moderated by Raquel, they built something that extends far beyond these galleries. I had the privilege of watching artists turn to one another with genuine curiosity and respect, asking each other for advice, challenging one another's thinking with generosity, sharing stories of family, place, and making, and offering their labor, their knowledge, and their kindness without hesitation. Those exchanges may not always be visible to visitors, but they are woven into the deepest fabric of this exhibition. In the exhibition book, Raquel describes this experience as, quote, a relational research process that situates art as fieldwork, friendship as epistemology. I can't imagine a more beautiful way to describe what has happened here. I hope you'll hear some of that generosity, curiosity, and friendship reflected in this conversation you're about to experience. Before we hand things over, I'd like to thank TK1, who are joining us today to live stream this conversation so audiences beyond Taos can participate. Thank you for helping us share the exhibition more broadly. And one last thing before I hand things over, it's actually Raquel's birthday tomorrow. I would really love it if everyone would join me in singing happy birthday to Raquel. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Raquel. Happy birthday to you. Thank you, everyone. And now, Raquel.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so moving. I moved to tears, and I'm just floored by the experience of returning a year later to Taos, to the Harwood, and to be in the same space as these wonderful artists, thinkers, researchers. Me da mucho placer estar aquí en este grupo con un grupo brillante de artistas, investigadores y pues gente tan genial y tan generosos que con sus tiempos y con sus ideas. Me encanta mucho estar aquí y bueno, espero tener una conversación súper encantadora con el grupo aquí y espero que ustedes también puedan disfrutar de las ideas de estos geniuses. Okay, amazing. Bueno, we have the hour. And so we have 6 artists. That means we have about 10 minutes that will take place over the course of the hour with each participant. I have a group of questions and that I've shared with the group ahead of time. And so I hope you're all taking notes. You're soaking it up. You're after this panel, we go get lunch, come back at 4 p.m., soak it up again. Vamos a empezar con, bueno, pienso que vamos a empezar con Gabriel. Con Gabriel y vamos a cada turno después de Gabriela. Entonces Gabriel, Ron, Christine, Tino, and so on and so forth. Y con Joanna y Rafa Esparza. Y la pregunta es que quiero hacer, bueno, ¿cómo empezamos a trabajar con este medio? Y también les invito a hablar sobre los registros expresivos asociados al barro y a los materiales terreos. How did you all start working in this medium? I invite you to speak to mud and earthen materials, the attending registers of expression, your origin stories, las historias de origen.
Bueno, gracias. En primer lugar, por invitarme a ser parte de esta conversación y por ser parte también de la exposición, ¿no? Recién conversaba con Ronald de la importancia de insistir sobre este material en el arte contemporáneo, que es un tema tan difícil porque en verdad es un material pobre, ¿no? Y yo quería enfocarme en este comentario que te digo para contar un poco cómo comencé, ¿no? En el año 2016 yo comencé haciendo estas esculturas que en este material de adobe, pero originalmente la quería hacer en resina, porque en verdad era el material que usaban todos mis contemporáneos en Argentina, los escultores, y yo, como era un artista joven y tenía mucha admiración por estos otros artistas, mi idea era poder hacer en este material. Entonces me encontré con una realidad que tenía que ver conmigo, con mi historia con el norte de Argentina. Yo soy del norte, no de la capital. Y básicamente no tenía dinero para comprar resina. Y entonces estaba en la casa de mis padres en ese momento y empecé a buscar cómo podía resolver la escultura, ¿no? Porque además era un año muy importante en el año 2016, porque eran los 200 años de independencia de Argentina de España, ¿no? Entonces a mí me habían invitado a hacer una exposición y yo me había concentrado mucho en qué pasaba en Argentina antes de esos 200 años, ¿no? Pero de cualquier manera yo quería hacerla en resina, pero porque veía a mi otro contemporáneo y tenía el deseo de hacer estas piezas basadas en formas indígenas, y quería eso, ¿no? Sin embargo, la realidad me hizo chocar contra la pared, básicamente, y lo que había en la casa de mi madre era barro, ¿no? Y en el fondo de la casa de mis padres había un horno de pan, de hacer pizza, ¿no? Eh, entonces empecé a acordarme de técnicas que estaban ahí, que siempre fueron parte de la historia familiar, en verdad, que yo un poco no las incluía en nada, en mi historial con las imágenes. Yo venía hace muchos años trabajando con imágenes, eh, pero siempre también a través de Art Now, ¿no? Y mirando otros artistas de afuera que me inspiraban mucho. Sin embargo, mi comienzo con el barro fue eso, fue un darme contra la pared y volver a revisar memorias que siempre estuvieron ahí y que yo no me quería hacer cargo. Entonces ahí empecé a mezclar estos materiales, acordarme de las técnicas que usaba mi padre, y así fui cubriendo la escultura y se armó este material que hasta el día de hoy me fue llevando por diferentes partes del mundo.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My origin story connected to Adobe comes from, I am from this region, and my family has lived here for probably several thousand years. My earliest memories are connected to Adobe. My father built with Adobe. He was a school teacher, and he taught building trades, and he was a carpenter in the summer and built houses. We built houses together. We built a new Adobe house for his sister, for one of his colleagues, another school teacher. Prior to going to graduate school in architecture, our last project together was working on a restoration of a two-story Adobe house from the 1800s. And so it's always been part of my life. I still live in my great-grandfather's house, which is an Adobe house that's about 100 years old now. And so this connection that I have is very deep. And it's also crosses several timelines for me, and I think this is what influences my practice. My father was a carpenter in a village full of Adobe buildings, and so we're often thinking about this relationship between a traditional building practice of mud and and then putting bathrooms in these buildings, or putting electricity in them, or building a wood frame addition to them. And this juxtaposition, this contrast, became very interesting to me, especially when I went off to architecture school and studied contemporary and modern architecture. And I entered architecture school at the age of the digital era, when architects began using the computer for the first time. And the forms and architectural shapes that would come out of those design practices that I was learning were very smooth and very biomorphic. And it was interesting to me to see that Adobe wasn't part of the conversation that connected us to those same kind of forms, because those forms, as we see in New Mexico, are biomorphic inherently because of their relationship to the hand. And our hand shapes those forms, leaving a biomorphic imprint on the buildings, leaving our imprint, our human imprint on the buildings. My interest in contemporary architecture led me to discover that almost all of the modern architects in architectural history, from Wright to Gaudí, Schindler, all designed buildings made of earth. And that was really exciting to me to learn that. And it showed me that there was a contemporary modern history of Adobe. And at that time in the digital era, I was interested in what's next. If the next era of architecture was digital, how could Adobe participate in that? And that eventually led me to thinking about how digital design and robotics could participate in the making of Adobe. And so I don't see it as a disconnection between the hand and the material. I think it as one more step of a 10,000-year evolution of humans making architecture with mud, using different kinds of tools. And this is a new tool, and this is how I landed where I am today, working with these mediums of Adobe and robotics.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. The origin story of Adobe goes back to my grandmother. So my mother's side of the family is from Llanito, which is a small village between Albuquerque and Bernalillo. So I grew up going to Bernalillo and didn't discover until later when I was doing a residency in Santa Fe that my mother was not from Bernalillo, she was from Llanito. And I remember thinking at that time I was making, as an artist, a lot of work that was really concerned with kind of the ways that we were seeing climate change affect our daily lives. And I realized that I was making this work without a kind of subjectivity or a foundation for how I was implicated in the work. And so when I came to Santa Fe, it gave me this opportunity to kind of link the questions that I had as an artist through this kind of material process that belonged to the matrilineal side of my family. And I started to work with the material completely without training, just blindly, feeling through the techniques with a adobera in Albuquerque named Helen, who Joanne knows as well and works with. And I just remember going to Helen, just showing up at her house because she lives in the place where they produce the adobe bricks. My grandmother was also somebody who produced a lot of adobe bricks, and my whole family, including my mother, for construction companies. They were farmers. They did anything they could to survive. And my grandfather was a sheep herder in Utah, so he would be gone for much of the year. And so my grandmother wasn't alive at that time, but I kind of relied on Helen's knowledge to help me produce a very large cast adobe sculpture that I made in the ground in Santa Fe at the Art Institute. And that was my first foray, just completely head in, 800 pounds. I was like driving their little Civic, old beat up car with like hundreds of pounds of adobe back and forth from Helen's place, and just killing myself, like physically. So it's a very physical process. I really like physical processes, and I didn't want to work with it in a traditional way. I wanted to think about its potential for to be used as a kind of like casting material. I was thinking about acequias at that time. My grandmother grew up on the algodones ditch, and I was thinking about you know, the sustainability of adobe in a time of like you know, social disconnection from the means for which we exist. I was thinking about this idea of a water democracy that is so central to acequias. I was thinking about how do we kind of create agency within small communities for something as essential as water. And it just brought me to the acequias, and I started to research the law around it through UNM, which has a very prominent law program around water rights usage. I started to meet with acequia communities in northern New Mexico, and that just kind of birthed this like whole language that I've been doing now for over 10 years. And so now the funny thing is that then on my father's side, I'm Chalone, which is one of the 7 languages of Ohlone, which is indigenous to California. And I had to explore the way that material was also instrumental in the colonization and the enslavement of my father's side of the family. And so this material has literally guided me towards our migration stories and has woken up so much and connected me with a much larger, broader, real, like living side of my family that goes to the Mission Soledad in Central California, and connects me with my family who lives in Bakersfield. So there was a migration from after the missions were ended and secularization happened. We went to San Luis Obispo and then ended up in Bakersfield because we were also farmers on that side of the family. So it situates me wherever I go. You can say I have often like pushed back at curatorial, very fast moving curatorial projects that want you to be site specific, and I can't do the justice doing something site specific, but working with Adobe always kind of is site specific. It doesn't matter what you do, it always illuminates the history that is embedded in the land that you're working with. So it insists on that. I now live in Vancouver, which is a temperate rainforest, and I'm making adobe there in these really weird, you know, I don't know, it's like maybe a fake adobe. I don't know if it's real, but I feel like at this point I have a recipe. So we all have our recipes. We're cooks, you know, we're all cooks here. And yeah, that's the origin story.
Amazing. Thank you, Christine. We're going to hear from Santino Gonzales.
Oh, hello. Can we hear me? Great. I just want to say thank you again to everybody being here right now and to the Harwood and Fort Garland. This has been an incredible experience, and to be talking about this feels really special. I grew up in Los Lunas, just about 3 hours south of here, and so spent most of my life between Los Lunas and Albuquerque, and just by the virtue of growing up in this beautiful state, I'm surrounded by these structures. My Nana's house, the church we went to, the schools I went to, RGI, which is maybe going to be torn down, we'll see. But many of these locations have been around for some of the most important, meaningful moments of my life. And so becoming an artist, it was only a matter of time before its impression kind of made its way into the things that I was making. And so that was one step, but as I got older, I began looking around and asking questions, and it was actually my father who really clued me into Adobe as a practice, and he's here today. I'm glad to be here with him. And he taught me how to make bricks, and he learned from his father. And that felt very meaningful and special. And I learned that when he was maybe 9 years old or younger, that he helped build the bricks that they used to build their house. And that touched me in a way that was indescribable and has kind of set me on a path, which is, my entry point is familial and regional. And ultimately, it's a tool to connect, to connect me with these people that are here with me now and with the people that are no longer with us, the grandmothers and the fathers and those that, helped build the homes that came before and helped create the families that allow me to exist and allow us to kind of connect. And now, I get to talk with you all and make works where we get to share how we found our way here and find a way forward too.
Thank you, Tino. We'll hear from another New Mexican artist, Joanna Keane Lopez.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna. I love that both Christine and I have the relationship with Helen as a connecting force of Adobe knowledge. And my family, I'm born and raised in Albuquerque, but my father's family is from Socorro, south of Albuquerque. And over there we have an old land grant from 1815 that was given out to like 70 families at that time. And so it's known colloquially as Lopezville, but it was originally known as Chamizal. And on that property, most of it's been after my grandma Adelina died, most of it was foreclosed upon and lost. But it's basically a property with a bunch of old adobe buildings and that were built by my great-grandparents. But then you can see as time went on, it became adobe and cinder block, and then it was frame and stucco, and then it was trailers. And so you could really see this furthering away from a land-based lifestyle. And it was really interesting to me to just be able to see that so clearly within this particular landscape that's also on the historic Piero Pueblo, what Socorro used to be. And so I just became really fascinated by that because I didn't know my great-grandparents or my grandparents on that side, and they didn't really leave much behind other than these handmade homes made of mud. And they were so beautiful in these detailed ways because it was not, people think of adobe homes being like earth, but really it's earth and wood, the vigas from the mountains or the stone that they put maybe under the foundation of the home, or even the way that they paint the adobe walls, which oftentimes with this specifically for my great-grandfather's house was with calcimine paint. It's like a very chalky paint. And they even put wallpaper on the adobe plaster, and also a manta, like a fabric that goes underneath the vigas that was used so that the original earthen roof wouldn't drop dirt on people. And so the more I looked into it, it was more like earth and wood and stone and paper and fabric, and those all come together to create earthen vernacular architecture. And so that was really where I became very, very fascinated, and I think where my practice really comes from. And from there, in my early 20s, I started learning from some women here in Taos, New Mexico, to learn the art of the enjarradora and enjarrando, including Carol Cruz, who's in the show. And then I guess from there, I just started working a lot, and I actually teach, since 2020, I've been teaching workshops with Helen Levine of New Mexico Earth Adobes, which is an adobe manufacturing yard in Albuquerque that's been around since the 70s. And then I also sometimes partner with different community members to do workshops with them as well. So it's definitely come from a family, but also community relationship.
Thank you, Joanna. We'll hear from Los Angeles-based artist Rafa Esparza.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So nice to hear everyone's story and to be part of this conversation, to be part of this exhibit. My earliest memories of seeing adobe and being in an adobe dwelling was visiting my grandparents in my parents' hometown in Ricardo Flores Magón, Durango, Mexico. Visited when I was 4. Lived there for 2 years when I was a kid. And then every summer or every winter, my parents were very committed to ensuring that we had a relationship to Magon and to my family, to my grandparents, to my aunts and uncles and cousins. And so I remember visiting and coming back to the States and always feeling like I was traveling between two very different worlds. I think, Gabriel, what you were saying about this material being like a material of the poor is something that I very much resonate with. The town is a very small farming community. It's very still underdeveloped, for better or for worse. And so folks' relationship to farming that's their sustenance. The rain is so vital to their well-being. And so in the late 2000s, I asked my father to teach me how to make adobe. Our relationship had suffered some distance. I had come out as queer, gay to my family and my community. My dad had a really rough time kind of like accepting it. But so I knew from my mother that my dad was a brick maker in Magon before he migrated up to the States. And I don't know, as a ambitious art student, I thought I want to ask my dad to teach me how to make adobe, and hopefully that could like prompt some conversations that could help us bond. And so he agreed to teach me how to make bricks. We spent an entire afternoon in the backyard of the house that I grew up in Pasadena. And we talked about making adobe. None of the questions or conversations that I was hoping we would have happened in that moment. But he didn't leave the room when I entered it, and we're able to just kind of like be in the same space without fighting, without arguing, without being awkward. And I always look back to that moment as being kind of like this, experiencing this sacred transmission of receiving this this thing that he still remembered how to do because he had stopped making bricks when he migrated up to the States. And so that was the thing that most impacted me, our ability to be in a space and to communicate non-verbally by just having our hands kind of like mixing this material that my father had this knowledge of building with. Fast forward to 2014, by then our friendship or our relationship had been mended and we're really great friends. I invited him to lead the production of roughly 1,400 bricks that would be used to cover the surface of an existing sculpture made by another artist, Michael Parker, beside the LA River. And in that moment, I was thinking a lot about the history of adobe in Los Angeles and California and the mission system and the brick itself, how it kind of like is so fraught with this history of enslaved labor by all of the various indigenous peoples in the surrounding areas of the missions where they were built. And I invited my father to lead the team that consisted of primarily my biological family, my mother, who was also a brick maker in Mexico, all of my siblings, and my nieces and nephews that were born at the time. And I was interested in a few things. I was interested in using water from the LA River, which is now just like a channelized channel of a lot of drain water that dumps in the ocean, but it used to be an active, like, natural body of water, a river, and I wanted to use water from this river that has had this movement that exceeds when it became this concrete channel. I was also interested in this question of if my family and I, as a working unit, could form different relationships, right? Beyond a sibling, beyond a son, beyond a parent, and maybe also like disrupt some notions of labor that are heavily gendered within adobe brick making. And it was really beautiful to see my father kind of like step beside being a patriarch, and instead of telling us what to do, like just like very tenderly like teaching us how to like make something that he really cared about. And so my journey with adobe making has been very accumulative. I learned new things after every project, and I try to engage that knowledge in future projects. It's enabled me to work with hundreds of artists and non-artists into the space of mixing adobe, and to have different conversations about our relationships to land. It's allowed me to have critical conversations with art spaces, traditional art spaces throughout the country. I see it as a material and a process that's helping me rebuild a relationship to land.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rafa. I love hearing the story of your dad's role in your Adobe as a major part of your Adobe origin story. And so I mean, I'm happy that you shared it here too. So, but I'm gonna call on Rafa to start us in this next round of questions. What has it meant to you to encounter earthen-based artworks from different spatial, formal, geopolitical, and ancestral contexts present in Unearthing Futures, Desenterrando Futuros? Gabriel, vas a contestar último en esta ronda. ¿Qué ha significado para todos ustedes encontrarse con obras de arte hechas en materiales terreos provenientes de diversos contextos espaciales, formales, geopolíticos y ancestrales, de antepasados, que forman parte de la exhibición de Desenterrando Futuros? Entonces vamos a empezar con Rafa y terminar con Gabriel.
I feel so honored and privileged and lucky to be part of this conversation with everyone that's on the stage. Being able to experience the incredibly diverse approaches to working with earth, with adobe specifically. I'm excited to learn more about people's respective practices, but I'm also super excited about the rigor, the critical kind of like dispositions that come from these ways of working with land. I'm very excited about what happens after this exhibition.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I'm just so honored to be in the exhibition as well. So many, all you incredible artists. It's just amazing to be in conversation. One thing I've always, I guess this makes me think about is there often is like this, like sometimes people who work with Adobe are like, this is the right mix, like this is how you do it, like this is the right stickiness, this is the right amount of sand to clay ratio, or this is, and what I really love about this is everybody has such a specific way of working, whether it's with paper or steel or with robot or, or like a huge horno, or doing like the casting work you're doing. it's just so interesting because everybody in different areas, depending on where you're at, the dirt is different, and it's a different type of, sand can be round or it can be sharp, and usually you want sharp sand, or like even clay, it has so many different colors, and some of it's more expansive and cracks more in different areas. And so everyone has their own mixtures and recipes because of where you're at. And so it's just really beautiful to be in the show and just see different ways everyone's working with their recipes and exactly how they're putting it together.
It's been super awesome to witness the things unfold because, as you've mentioned, and everybody's mentioned, the practice, whether it's you're making one brick or an entire structure or a subterranean, revolution, it requires a lot of labor, a lot of body. I mean, the sculptures that I built, I did my best to work with just my family members. And so in Fort Garland, me and my two brothers, we built a piece there, and here, me and my partner Sam, we built a piece here. And I'm just fascinated by how willing everybody is to put themselves in the work and be vulnerable. And I'm not aware of a material like Adobe that is able to connect us to time as powerfully as it does. Each of us are engaging with time and memory in incredibly meaningful ways on the intimate scale and also on the cosmic scale. Rafa has these amazing paintings in his space of supernova, of the cosmic, and in my space there are sculptures of the iPod that my sister used to listen to playlists on, and between those two things, entire worlds can exist. And when these materials are tended to, they will outlive us. And so we all know that, and we're all thinking about that. And for me, it's like that folding and unfolding of being able to, all of us be able to connect with times past, the present, and also a future. And so I'm constantly inspired by everybody.
Such a great question, Raquel. I have to say that when we first had the online discussion for the catalog, I had never spoken to a group of contemporary artists of my generation who are working with a particular cultural knowledge and experience that so related to my experience. And I felt so seen. I just felt so, this is family. This is something I've needed for a long time. So it's like we speak a lot about, I think it's a generational thing. I think we all belong to the same generation, and our parents, it's like my mom being like, Hita, what do you want to know about Adobe? Like, we work so hard to move away from that kind of labor. And I'm like, well, but that's what we need to heal a lot of the things that we've gone through. And I think there's a relationality with our stories in why we work with that material. But I also think that there's, in the questions that we're asking each individually in our work, it's doing something that I think for the first time is being articulated through this exhibition in a really important way, it feels like. It feels like the exhibition is doing work that is so particular to this place, and then also connecting in such a kind of global way. So it just feels like I'm very grateful for what this group, this panel has been able to come together to talk about, and also the curatorial input, the community here. I don't know, I feel like this is just the beginning of something. So, yeah.
Thank you, Christine. We'll hear from Ronald Rael.
Thanks. Part of my larger investment in this exhibition is maybe goes to the point that Gabriel made and Rafa pointed out, which is that there's this understanding that that adobe is maybe a material for the poor, and so part of my investment is to push that a bit further and communicate that adobe is a material for the enlightened, and that in fact, in the realm of architecture, it is a material that is non-toxic. Represents the oldest materials, building materials on the planet, the oldest buildings on the planet. It's recyclable, produces no carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, it's an intelligent material. And within the context of contemporary art, there's meaning embedded within the material that each of the artists are communicating through. Ideas of politics, of archaeology, of ancestry, of history, of culture. And so for the material to have evolved from architecture into art seems like a fundamental trajectory, because it enters into a space of enlightenment. And to me, that's what's so beautiful about the work that's in this gallery. It's, no pun intended, it's totally groundbreaking. It really is like, it's taking contemporary art in a new direction. And I think the Harwood is really leading that conversation, particularly because this is a place where adobe is very much part of the culture, very deeply. And so I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and to hopefully think about the way that this material continues to evolve in the future.
Thank you, Ronald. Gabriel, su ponencia.
Yo pienso que bueno, el hecho que estemos acá reunidos conversando sobre este material me parece que también es un hecho histórico, ¿no? Porque a lo largo de la historia de las imágenes hubo diferentes materiales, no sé, en los 60 el plástico, ¿no? Y también eso trae consecuencia, el uso de los materiales y los comportamientos humanos que tenemos alrededor de esos materiales. Insistir, me parece que que lo que valoro de esta exposición es el hecho de insistir sobre determinados artistas, creadores, que estamos mirando hace un tiempo, ¿no? Con una mirada muy, lo notábamos recién, ¿no? Muy cercana con la memoria familiar, ¿no? Y por eso también le llamamos ancestral. Me parece que esas historias que están grabadas en nuestras memorias nos hacen tomar fuerza de este material e insistir en un mundo que está acostumbrado a la nobleza de los materiales, ¿no? En unas élites que determinan también qué es lo que hay que guardarse y qué es lo que debe desecharse, ¿no? Me parece que eso es lo interesante que yo noto en esta exposición. También lo noto conociendo un poco el sitio, digo, el pueblo. Me parece que es un... Si por mucho tiempo las ideas que nosotros como humanos las resguardábamos en materiales nobles como para representar la justicia, la democracia, y son materiales que después no necesitan tanto cuidado, ¿no? Me parece que este material implica un cuidado y una atención permanente que nos hace recordar que hay ideas que tienen que cuidarse, ¿no? Eso.
Gracias, Gabriel. Vamos a tomar un turno bien distinto a la próxima tema que vamos a discutir aquí bueno, porque la mayoría de la presencia aquí de los seres humanos son seres femeninos. Entonces voy a hacer una pregunta a las artistas que están aquí en el panel, a Christine y a Joanna. For the women artists on the panel, to consider earthen material at this time, because we are close to closing our conversation here, and I definitely want to touch on this theme. For the women artists on the panel to consider earthen material, a medium that feels and reads as masculine coded, what has it been like for the two of you to work in this medium?
I would say for me, what really brought me into it was women. specifically like Helen Levine, Carol Cruz. I studied with Anita up here too, and just knowing other women who work in the field have been really powerful. I would say that there is a lot of sexism around it, especially for like me building large-scale sculptural works. There's definitely been times where I'm like building them and I'm hiring like a contractor guy to help me, and people walk up and they think it's his project because they wouldn't think like this little lady's made that, you know? And like, that's definitely been something. And so I would definitely say it makes it so that I work extra hard to have like this certain, I think of it much as like a craft, you know, it's like an vernacular earthen architectural craft. And it's definitely a lifelong one. And so I love that there is a tradition of women who work in adobe, specifically with the mud plastering and jarando, mud plastering. And so I'm just really thankful for those people, those women in my life, and also the men who've been very helpful as well. But I think it has been challenging at times.
Yeah, I think this question is interesting because I always thought of it as a matrilineal inheritance. I never thought of it as being overly masculine. That said, I don't work with it in a traditional way in terms of making bricks. Bricks invites a whole other sense of labor that I think, totally, Joanna, when you're bringing it into that kind of weight, the mass that is involved in making things with bricks, I can absolutely see how the patriarchy is very embedded in that. And it's already very embedded in sculpture anyways. So, there's a history of that patriarchy, just maybe not, this is maybe the first time that the vernacular of adobe and sculpture is kind of coming together to kind of have a productive tension with that patriarchy that is still very at play in contemporary art. But I work with it in not in massive ways. So I don't really think of it in the way that I work with it as a very patrilineal inheritance. So yeah, always women have been the ones talking about how my grandmother is the one who was running the family construction business because my grandfather was away. So she really she was the businesswoman in this. So yeah.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Christine. And I think our last question for this round is, I'm going to ask you all to describe the relationship between concept and execution in your practice. Si pueden, ¿cómo describías la relación entre concepto y ejecución en tu práctica? Gabriel, vamos a empezar contigo, por favor. O si no, si prefieres que Rafa empiece, porque le di la pregunta bien tarde.
No, bueno, bueno, si está mala la respuesta, el público dirá. Yo pienso que no la separaría tanto, ¿no? Me parece que desde mi práctica, por ejemplo, el hecho de hacer trabajos que estén completamente hechos a mano, lo cual a veces me cansa y es un esfuerzo gigante, que se note todo el tiempo la mano, me parece que me conecta con algo que no es tan racional, ¿no? Y me encanta que se note el gesto, en verdad. Y en ese sentido, el lenguaje primitivo para mí es fundamental de visitarlo, de revisarlo, no sé, me ensucio mucho también, ¿no? con esta forma de trabajar y obviamente admiré mucho tiempo y sigo admirando otra forma de pensar el arte, de educarse también en la educación artística. De hecho, me eduqué de esa forma, con una presencia mucho más conceptual, ¿no? Pero cuando comencé a trabajar la escultura en sí de esta forma, pensé que no está separada una cosa de la otra. Entonces, para mí tiene que ver con la combinación de la fuerza del gesto. Y te diría que la parte conceptual tiene más que ver con el ingenio de cómo levantar eso que estoy haciendo, ¿no? Eso.
Genial, gracias, Gabriel.
Yo.
Por favor, a Ron.
Because I'm a trained architect and not trained in arts, most of my concepts are architectural concepts. And because the work that I've been doing is research and development, it's incomplete as architecture. And so it results in questions about how do you make a wall, or how do you make a roof out of adobe, or how do you make textures, and how do you control the movement of a robotic arm to extend to its further extent and to retract as close as it can to the machine. And so in a way, there's a lot of pragmatics that are connected to that. And because they're incomplete, I think they look like sculpture. They maybe fall in the historical definition of like follies, maybe like experiments in the landscape. And so you know, the work is really on the way to architecture. It's a journey on the way to making buildings, and I'm currently completing the first 3D printed permitted building made out of Adobe, simultaneously to me producing this one. But those are the concepts. The concepts are about movement, about the deposition, the strength of the material. But like I say, in their incomplete form, they're also exploring space, and they're exploring light, and they're and they take on that sensibility in this kind of raw state. But I mean, I think it's very different than the concepts that are explored in art practice. And I'm really grateful to be around artists to think about how architecture can be influenced by art. That's, to me, the most important lesson I'm taking in this.
Thank you, Ron. We'll hear from Christine next.
I think I'm in thinking about the relationship between concept, research, and then, you know, the final outcome of an artwork. I think that every project leads to the next project. Every question is kind of happening in iteration. So I don't see it as like ever starting whole cloth in anything. I think I'm just trying to, I feel like there is the personal project that is very ancestral. And then there is there are the questions that come out of that is very public and has a lot of interest and questioning around the canonization of art, the canon, history. I'm really interested in history. And I'm really interested in how we can learn from history in order to think about where we need to go. So I'm constantly kind of like trying to I'm trying to reveal, or I'm trying to turn over things that are both in the history of art, which in that world you can think about the history of land arts, which was very much a white patriarchal Western lens. A lot of it, which comes out of California, was born out of the descendants of archaeologists and anthropologists, the anthropological gaze that was very very responsible for the erasure of indigenous California tribes and languages. And so I'm really invested in revealing that. Like, for instance, Ursula K. Le Guin, who's an author that I have read my whole life, whose father is Alfred Kroeber, who was maybe one of the most notorious anthropologists in California, who worked with Ishi, which is maybe the most well-known story of a Yaqui, one of the last Yaqui indigenous people who were living traditionally and then became an experiment of Kroeber's. And so you can look at someone like Ursula K. Le Guin's fiction and fantasy, and you can see embedded, and she talks a lot about this directly, the influence her father. And I've been to her house where she grew up in California, and I'm really like, I don't think of it as an antagonism. I think about it as trying to understand the connection, because we're all kind of related in this really complicated way. And so I'm trying to understand how I'm looking at the archive for knowledge. And we're as a community, as a Cholon community, we work with the archive to find our traditions, our ceremonies, and our language. And I feel like art is that kind of colonial archive as well, at least the Western canon. So in that area, that is very related to some of the kind of historical engineering histories and events that I'm really interested. So I'm really interested in things that Ronald is doing around architecture, because that's very intersecting with my interest in the way that architectural forms create a kind of colonial paradigm, a dominant paradigm in the landscape. So all of that comes together through a kind of aesthetic language, and while the research is very what they call interdisciplinary, and I would say indigenous people have been interdisciplinary since time immemorial. There is no such thing as interdisciplinarity, but yet I am an interdisciplinary artist. But I would say all those things come together in the language of aesthetics, and I think aesthetics are a very particular vehicle that can do the poetic work that has an effect in your body, and that's what I ultimately want. I want the viewer to feel it in their body, and I think Adobe has this power to do that. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Christine. We'll hear from Tino next.
Yeah, it's crazy making anything, but it often begins with an idea or a feeling. You know, how do you conjure the feeling of what it's like to be comforted by like the home of the radio in your grandmother's home? Or how do you get the idea out of your head of a flying brick? What do you do? How do you make that? And for me, and so it's like it starts often with that idea or that feeling, and then it moves to a drawing, and then that piece became an animation. I'm referring to a series that you'll see upstairs called Ascension, which are some photographs of some bricks. And that's what it was. It was just an idea that began in my head. And in the process of making it, of just trying to seek out this intuitive pool, more things began to happen. You know, being in the room and working with the incredible crew here and hanging the pieces up and seeing it in the space, it then begins to do something else. And so it's able to kind of represent this idea that I have, like this, almost like this dream of envisioning a brick kind of breaking itself off of a building, and you know, nobody's looking, it's late at night, and it just takes flight and just soars away and supersedes all of us, you know, all the people, all of time, all the borders, all of everything. And that was the idea. And so that was one idea. And then I, you know, made the image and worked with my brothers, and we launched bricks in the air and photographed them. And then it also did this other thing where it reminded me of, you know, my favorite science fiction films as a child, you know, The Monolith and Space Odyssey, or, you know, and chatting with Rafa and the other artists and talking about the works, you know, there's this new thing that began to happen where I'm seeing this image of this floating brick. And in the process of building things, you know, sometimes you'll have a bad brick or a discarded brick or one that you might not want to use. And so you cast it aside, or you might cast it to somebody else to use. And I'm becoming fascinated by this moment where, you know, this brick isn't rising or isn't falling, but it's briefly hovering and floating and kind of doing something different and vibrating on this different plane. And so I'm not entirely sure even what it is yet, but it is something that I'm, you know, seeking out and trying to create based on this a vision or a feeling. And that's how it goes, you know. And sometimes it takes me to a place where I'm becoming a ham radio operator, things like that.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you, Tina. We're going to hear from Joanna next.
Yeah, as far as concept, I'll speak specifically to the project that I have here, Energetic Materials. It's very much, it's about the Tularosa Basin and how thinking about multi-use landscapes and contested landscapes, such as specifically White Sands Missile Range, that also acts simultaneously as ranch lands. So it's in civilian and military at once. And I became really interested in this. I think it really began with my parents. My father, Damasio Lopez, has been an activist against depleted uranium his entire life. And my mother, my late mother, Colleen Ann Keane, she worked with indigenous communities for 50 years and also was a documentary filmmaker and made The River That Harms, which is a documentary on the Church Rock spill, which was the largest radioactive waste spill in US history that took place on Navajo lands. And so growing up, I was very aware of environmental and indigenous issues in the Southwest. And so as I started to work more and more with adobe as a material and thinking about craft, I couldn't help but think about the land and what's happening in those areas as well. And so specifically for the project upstairs, a lot of those ranches over at White Sands Missile Range are made of earth and stone, but also thinking about you know, what's happening with that landscape that's being used for ballistics investigations as well. And so my process with that, a lot of my family lives in Luis Lopez, and they're multi-generational ranchers, but they also work for White Sands Missile Range. So spending a lot of time with them, and I ended up focusing more on film and just filming them doing the work that they do at their ranches that is actually inside White Sands Missile Range and adjacent to. And then that moved towards going to the White Sands Missile Range Museum and also studying an archive that's over at the New Mexico State University, which is called the Oral History Project of Early Ranching Life at White Sands Missile Range that was collected in the 1990s. And so that's part of the work that's upstairs. So a lot of it's from doing site visits and thinking a lot about archive like Christine does, but also thinking about how do you create archive through actually doing interviews or making films, or, you know, that becomes a part of the archive going further. And then, you know, going into it more and then actually bringing like the dirt from over there and bringing it into the installation to kind of bring all those elements together.
Awesome. Thank you, Joanna. We'll hear from Rafa Esparza.
I guess the way in the question is phrased, it feels like that. Well, it is. It's a very rigid, linear kind of like process, concept, execution, and it feels like it's a very disciplined kind of like way to move through an art process, right? Because as much as we want to like believe or assume that art is like this very free space, it's not. It's very disciplined, and it's very fraught. And I feel like I come to my practice through performance, through live performance, and there's a lot of improvisation that happens, your openness to be impacted by people on the streets, to sounds, to the weather, to anything that could happen in that live moment. And I also kind of like approach art understanding and never losing sight that art is something that's imported. that follows the trajectory of colonial violence, right? And so whenever I'm making something, an invitation could also feel like another confrontation with art, another confrontation with the museum again. And so I feel like allowing myself to improvise and to, we were talking last night about rascuache, this like being able to make something with what you have. And I know that maybe sometimes we read that as an aesthetic, maybe process. I see it more as an attitude. And allowing yourself to make and think outside of this very rigid way of these expected ways of making and presenting an idea. But there's a lot of pivoting in this project that's in the museum. I feel like it still embodies honest kind of like idea, I guess, that really inspired the work. But I feel like adobe is also like this malleable material that also kind of like allows us an opportunity to like make mistakes. You know, when you're building, it's like, and everything is not level, you could correct it on the next course, you know? If something is too dry, you could just re-wet it or remold it. It's really generous in the way that it allows us to kind of like build a relationship to it as a material.
Amazing. Thank you, Rafa. Now is the opportunity for the Q&A. So if you have your Qs, I'm sure the artists will be happy to provide the As. But before we do that, I just want to also acknowledge, give a shout out and flowers, props to Dr. Alice Inez Guzman, who has been a wonderful, an incredible, necessary interlocutor for this process, who's been very much part of the conversations that Christine had described, the Zoom conversations, and has generated a lot of really powerful questions for the folks here on the panel. So Alice Inez Guzman, I invite you to also ask a question, if not now, at some point, no pressure, but would love to have your voice in the mix too. So just no pressure, but if you have one, I'll come back to you. But I did see a hand back there. What is your name? Carol Piper. Patbird. Peppered. Sorry, Carol. Carol, let's see. I wish we could do a Phil Donahue thing and hand you the mic, but we can't. So if you can use your best outdoor theater voice, that'd be awesome. As the artists consider this question, I'm going to do my best to traducir la pregunta sobre un continuo de la temporalidad, las posibilidades de liberación con el objeto del barro, del objeto del ladrillo de adobe. ¿Cómo puedes presentar una idea que se enfrente con esa pregunta?
Yo pienso que si en el relato inicial de la primera pregunta que tú nos hiciste de cómo iniciamos esta conexión con el material, de una u otra manera el barro llegó hasta nuestros padres, nuestros abuelos, con lo cual me parece que ahí hay una resistencia grande, ¿no? porque nosotros ahora estamos hablando en un museo sobre este material, pero hace muchos años que las personas, un grupo grande de personas, en este caso indígenas, vienen sosteniendo, ¿no? Con mucha resistencia, porque incluso, por ejemplo, yo puedo hablar de Argentina, eh, eh, muchos pueblos indígenas en verdad están renunciando al adobe y quieren otros materiales y ahora, digo, son un grupo de intelectuales o de artistas que van a frenar eso, ¿no? Y eso es muy extraño, ¿no? Yo simplemente hablo del caso de Argentina, que es el que más conozco, eh, pero también en sociedades occidentales como la nuestra, donde lo malo en general tendemos a demonizarlo, y durante mucho tiempo se demonizó estas arquitecturas, estas formas, porque se creía que se llenaba de insectos, que después, no sé, el mal del Chagas, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y yo encontré fotografías en periodos de los años 50 en Argentina, por ejemplo, donde las casas se incendiaban directamente delante de las familias, porque, bueno, porque estaba el mal del Chagas, ¿no? Entonces, lo que quiero decir con esto es que vuelvo a decir, celebro que podamos hablarlo en un museo, en este país, y que seamos un grupo de personas que estamos interesados en saber más, eh, pero creo que el gran mérito es de las comunidades periféricas, en verdad, que habitan en todo el mundo, en verdad, y que realmente están pisando la tierra, ¿no? Y creo que en buena hora que nuestro ojo esté mirando hacia ahí.
Gracias, Gabriel.
Are we going to go around?
Yeah.
I'll just build upon what Gabriel was saying about the material being demonized and the indigenous and traditional cultures turn away from the material as a way of maybe thinking they need to participate in contemporary Western society. But I want to mention a project that's in the exhibition that Rafa and I collaborated on, which is called Vislumbre del Horizonte, which is a glimpse of the horizon. And for me, it's a very powerful statement about revealing and giving a glimpse of the 1916 construction of the Harwood. So we're giving a glimpse of the past. But I think the exhibition in this title, Desenterrando Futuros, is about giving also a glimpse of the future, of the horizon to come. And this is really an opportunity to think about the urgency of the need to return to this building material practice and continue these traditions in the future because of sustainability, ecological performance, and all of the beauty that earthen materials provide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ron. Does anybody else on the panel want to address? Okay. Yes, Dr. Alicia Inez Guzman. Amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and just recap your question for our live Zoom audience. So Dr. Alicia Inez Guzman is asking the artists on the panel to speak to the ambivalences of the earthen materials that are metaphorically saturated with these histories of dispossession, histories of contamination, and the way that adobe has been in service to settler expansion, and so what does it mean to get to the underbelly of the materials, as you said? Thank you.
Could I
Oh,
start?
Rafa, yes, Rafa will be answering.
I think all of those, the fraught nature of land and different places, I think is something that continue to interest me in wanting to work with adobe, to directly speak to some of these histories and some of these violences. But I think beyond the object, for me, it's really important to like work with adobe in a way that like brings people into the process of making it, and those people being very intentionally like brown and queer and being part of communities that that exist kind of like marginalized within the art world. Not only for the sake of like inclusivity, but also like to imagine different ways of working, you know, in all of the different like opportunities that I've had to work with adobe. I've really strived to exist outside of this kind of like capitalist mode of production that really kind of like takes time away from us. And so being able to move at a pace that, you know, different folks within the group have different capacities to kind of like adhere to, and yeah, kind of like, I guess, constantly kind of like having not only these histories, but how these histories endure through like systematically and structurally, specifically like in art spaces, because this is where I'm presenting the work, to kind of like fight it, because it's so easy to kind of like assimilate into these spaces, right? And to the work be co-opted, right? And so like having this conversation is so important, right? Because we're getting to kind of like speak to like how we want this work to be contextualized, like what's really important, like what's in the underbelly of all of these different practices. And so that's something that came up to me right away, is like not only like the object itself, but like what kind of culture could be formed around making this type of work with the people that gather around it.
Thank you, Rafa. Joanna?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question of Alicia. I think that adobe can really be very much romanticized. And it's a very smart building technique that makes sense in this area. But the more that I started to understand it, it was more, you start to think about land and the memory of land, and like what is the memory of that land that's made into that home. So yeah, for instance, after the Trinity bomb in South Central New Mexico, the world's first nuclear bomb, a lot of the communities in the area, pretty much everyone, was not told what happened, and so they just continued to build their homes out of earth, which is the vernacular building method in that area. And they didn't know. And same thing with a lot of the Dene communities where there's uranium mines, and making hogans or making, making their homes, and that being also contaminated. And there's a history of that as well. And so I think the more that you understand land, often through archive of what even happened in these areas, you may not even know what happened in this landscape, or maybe sometimes it's through stories too that are passed down of understanding what happened. And so I think understanding and researching, of course, you know, even into, of course, indigenous histories of that landscape, but then even what kind of industry has been in that area, or what kind of military impact. Yeah, so that's something I've really come to understand, and that I'm really interested in pushing further through research.
I think just in a really broad way, and I have one story that I think is really appropriate for the question that you're asking, but in a really broad way, working with Adobe makes me, at the heart of it, is I keep coming back to the really contentious history of settlement, and that at the heart of colonization is land, and land that has been manipulated as a resource. And I was invited to go and produce a work of art in Seoul, Korea, with Adobe. And I was given an assistant paired with a student from Hongik University, who's an amazing student, and we spent 2 weeks together, 10 hours a day, just working like crazy in this residency that was situated in a landfill. And the landfill had been turned into a park. And I knew nothing of this history. This is the anecdote of what I mean when I say you kind of are given these situations that probably require a lot more research to think about the context in which you're working, but you're not given that as an artist, but it nonetheless reveals itself. And so when we started to work with the forms of the missions in Seoul, at the same time at the Craft Museum there, the figure of the arch was also being interrogated as a colonial form coming from Japan. And Japan had brought it from Europe. And I was thinking about it from the 1830s as coming to California. So we're thinking about this moment of globalization that was happening in the 1830s. Walter Benjamin talks a lot about this in the arcades. And I was just kind of floored to encounter this in Seoul. And then we started digging into the ground, and we were given permission by the people there who were running the park. And when we started digging into it, this putrid smell. And I realized me and my assistant were like, oh, this is really toxic. And then another artist who is from Seoul, who's Korean, told me, oh yeah, this is where they dumped all of the material from the collapsed mall that happened in the 90s, when Korea had just become a democracy and they were building on a level of like trying to catch up with capitalism. And the law was that you could only hire Korean contractors that were way overspent. And so they were making a lot of like missteps in the construction. And it collapsed, and those bodies were not recovered. And so it's basically like a mass grave there. And that's how Seoul understands that place. And I didn't know that. So we were building with this really toxic soil that had a very visceral like smell to it. And so we had to wear gloves and masks and everything. I had never had that experience before. And so it was a really a big lesson for me in terms of this question that you're asking around toxicity, history, how that gets presence within the work that you make. There was a lot of other fraught things that happened with that work in relation to the government there and how they were thinking about my work, which is a much longer story. But yeah, that was something.
Well, I know that I can go on and on as a listener of these panelists, of these investigators, researchers, artists, but the time has come for this to end. And so I'm sorry for those who have queues on the Zoom if you have queues, but thank you so much for your presence. And Rafa Esparza, Joanna Keane Lopez, Santino Gonzales, Christine Howard Sandoval, Ronald Rael, and Gabriel Chaile. Gracias, gracias, gracias. Ya vamos a terminar. Thank you, Harwood Museum, and thank you for everyone for being here. Go get lunch, contribute to the Taos tourist economy, and come back at 4 p.m.